This is an RNZ podcast.
I decided to meet you here on the waterfront because in 1898 the SS Wakatipu sailed into Wellington Harbour, and there was a young lady on board called Ching Fan, and she became Chin Ting's wife. Now, they weren't married at the time, so he rowed out to the boat and the captain married them while they're on the boat.
A story from over a century ago of forging a new home thousands of miles from Canton in China. I'm Kadambari Raghukumar, and I'm here meeting Wellingtonian Cameron Sang at the harbour downtown.
I could have done the cliche and gone up to Haining Street and Frederick Street, where it was Chinatown, but really a lot of the work I've done, it was like, well, everywhere has somewhere of significance for the Chinese. I've plotted, Chinese shops all over the city, all in the suburbs, everywhere.
Cameron is the descendant of that couple he just spoke of, a product of the Thing and Sang family from Guangzhou. He spent a good part of the last decade gathering stories, anecdotes and family charts to create his vast free online repository, Wellington Chinese. We're coming back to Cameron shortly, but I'm meeting the lady who actually put me in contact with him, Dr. Phoebe Lee, who isn't related to any of those old trading families Cameron speaks of, but is an independent researcher from China who lives in New Zealand. Exactly a year ago, Phoebe released her book Golden Enterprise, New Zealand Chinese Merchants, 1860s to 1970s. The book's been longlisted for the 2025 Ockham New Zealand Book Awards for illustrated non-fiction. I'm meeting her at the National Archives, the corridors of which she's come to be well versed with over the years, thanks to hours spent poring over old arrival documents of Wellington's early Chinese settlers. So what do we have here?
Oh, this is the receipt showing these people they have paid the poll tax. Oh. This is the period covering from 1919 and to
1920. Starting from the mid-1800s, Chinese immigrants began to arrive in New Zealand. Some went to work the mines, others setting up trading outposts, and some catered to the needs of the growing community in the country. By 1881, there were already about 5,000 Chinese in the country. And that's when the poll tax was introduced as a means to restrict immigration.
So these are all the fingerprints of people that arrived and paid the poll tax?
Yeah. Original receipts.
It's in very good condition, isn't it?
Yes, because this is official records. Once they're done, that not many people look at, really. Yeah.
Phoebe's research over the years has been motivated by a drive to look deeper into New Zealand society and the various groups of early settlers that comprised it.
For a very long time, New Zealand was known as a, British colony, and the majority of New Zealanders were English, Scottish, Irish, So for a very long time, the narrative of New Zealand history is predominated by the stories of these three groups, right? And later on, there was a Maori history became an important part of this national narrative of New Zealand. I want to point out that the New Zealand history was much more complex. There were not only these four groups of people, there were others, like, for example, the Chinese. But you don't see their stories in the narratives of mainstream New Zealand history work.
Like some of her previous works, Phoebe's latest book focuses on early merchants who were instrumental in the microeconomy that serviced early Chinese immigration.
As one of this minority member of the minority group, and I feel that was fascinating. That gave me it's just like an interest. Curiosity. I wanted to find out more stories about the country's past, how New Zealand was made and became today as it is. And there was so much more waiting you to discover.
When you talk about the idea of Chinese merchants, some of the earliest Chinese merchants here in New Zealand, particularly the ones that you have written about in Golden Enterprise, What sort of trade were they involved in?
Chinese merchants that I discussed in this book, they were counterpart of those companies in Hong Kong or in Guangzhou named as gold mountain firms. So these kind of firms, they provided one-stop services like helping people to migrate to the gold mountain countries.
Gold mountain countries being Australia, the United States, Canada and New Zealand, anywhere gold mining showed promise of being a lucrative enough reason to migrate during those years.
And it's because of gold, but also because these 4 countries could offer better wages, higher living standards, that the people wanted it to come. And they consider this at Gold Mountain. But some people came not because of gold, and they did market garden. Now, in the U.S., Canada, they were railway workers and so forth. So it's different. But this Gold Mountain is kind of metaphorical, word.
In Wellington, there were a handful of such registered companies that Phoebe found from her research that took her to Guangzhou and Hong Kong. So it was a thriving network, and many of the firms operated from buildings you'll still walk past in Wellington today.
Helping them with immigration paperwork, also international ticketing, and also helping those people to remit their incomes from overseas back to home. And they also exported Chinese groceries to maintain their way of life, and also providing their accommodation.
One of those trading families was Cameron's ancestor, Chin Ting, who became a prominent businessman and community leader after arriving in New Zealand on the ship you heard briefly about at the beginning of the podcast.
It's a very large, very early family that came to New Zealand.
Yeah. Well, Sang is obviously my father's family, and he was actually born in Fiji. And on my mother's side of the family, which is the Ting family, they've been around in New Zealand since the late 1800s.
That's the descendants of Chin Ting.
Yeah, and in fact, I decided to meet you here on the waterfront because in 1898, the SS Wakatipu sailed into Wellington Harbour, and there was a young lady on board called Ching Fan, and she became Chin Ting's wife. Now, they weren't married at the time, so he rowed out to the boat, and the captain married them while they're on the boat. And the reason they did that was because the wives of naturalised New Zealanders didn't have to pay the poll tax to come in. Now, the New Zealand government wasn't going to have any of that, so they made them pay the poll tax anyway.
Despite being married on board?
Despite being married, because they claimed that, well, it wasn't outside the 3-mile limit, so technically true.
Yes.
But they took it to court, and after 3 years, they got a ruling in their favour to have the poll tax refunded. It took 7 years for them to actually get it back.
And that was £100 at that time?
£100 at the time, so quite a significant amount of money. So I quite like coming along the waterfront and seeing, in the harbour.
That's right. This is a place
that
where
bit of history.
In many ways is intricately connected. Well, it's in many ways inextricably connected to the family that you come from.
Yep. And I learnt about that story and about the SS Wakatipu probably about 15 years ago. I was working for a government agency, and we're working through our pepeha. And I sort of felt quite uneasy with the sort of the boilerplate, template that we had to use. And I was thinking, wanted to research more, and I wanted to try and connect the idea of iwi and hapu with my own family, with the villages and the clans and the county societies and the like that were formed at the time. And that sort of led me down a long journey that started with kaupapa Māori.
Cameron's been steadily growing his online collection of stories, and he tells me he hears from all sorts of people connected with the Chinese community who contribute to the community repository.
A lot of it was really remembering bits of stories that people told me and things that I read, and going, I'm not going to remember all of these, And especially as my grandparents' generations were starting to go, I was going, these stories are going to disappear from memory. And even just little things that Mum would tell me, I'm going, oh yeah, Mum would talk about this place. And what was it? And then I'd go, oh, and then something else is connected to it. So I was trying to join all these things together. I originally just wanted to have like a map of Wellington and say, these are the places that were important for the Chinese community, the original Chinese community, back in the 1890s, 1900s, up until 1940s, 50s and 60s. And then other Chinese New Zealanders would chirp in and would have a conversation going. And then in the background there was also a lot of talk about te ao Māori, about tikanga, about the use of te reo Māori. And I was seeing a lot of similarities in the stories and the experiences, and I just wanted to build it up and really so I wouldn't lose it, but also so the next generation down, so they would have something to see as well, and read the stories and be able to tell the stories and talk about them with their grandparents, and have my parents' generation really being able to talk about it as part of the history of Aotearoa New Zealand.
Peppered amongst all those stories, Cameron tells me of the challenge of learning and recording the stories of racism, prejudice and hardship his ancestors faced.
I sort of wondered a few times, what my ancestors, when they first came here, and they were more or less forced to integrate into the European Pākehā way of life as much as possible. But I also wonder, when they were saw the Māori, when they saw the mana whenua, and started understanding their culture and the way they organised themselves within their iwi, and how their family structure worked, the whānau structure worked, and the connection they made when they saw their whare with the ancestors carved on the buildings, which were, there are a lot of similarities to what they were used to at home with, honouring their ancestors, paying tribute to them, food being very central, having, a lot of respect with the elders. I sort of feel that, if we were able to have worked closer socially with mana whenua, it would have had a lot smoother transition for my ancestors here.
One of the things I often wonder about websites like yours is it's a living archive, isn't it? Because every day has the possibility of you finding something new.
Exactly. I've pretty quickly came to the conclusion that I could not document everything. And so I really focused on things that caught my attention, something unusual, quirky, stories that hadn't been told, and let that be a way that other people could tell stories. And everything I see is publicly available, or it's been published before, so it does stand up to some sort of academic rigour, but there's still a bit of a personal point of view put in terms of what I actually choose to have in there. There was one article, and it was probably about the third or fourth article I came across, and it was one paragraph long. It was from a newspaper, and it was from Greytown, and it said something along the lines of, there's reports of a Chinese doctor living on a marae in Greytown amongst the natives, and he's doing very well. And that fascinated me, partly because I had a friend who's lives in Greytown and worked in the area of race relationships and the like, and we discussed the story and we're quite curious, and I thought I'll never find out who it is. It's just going to be one of these things that will be will be in some sort of oral history somewhere. And then a few years later I got an email from someone and said, oh look, I've come across your website, can I show you some of the work I've done about her their grandfather. And we worked out that her grandfather was a doctor that was living on the marae in Greytown. Connections. I've left that story alone because now I've found a direct family member to tell that story, it's their story to tell and not mine. So that's been something that really blew my mind when those connections came together.
So while Wellington's Chinese history continues to fascinate researchers and community members over 100 years on, people like Phoebe Lee and Cameron Sang are helping keep those history records well and alive. That's today's episode of Here Now with me, Kadambari Raghukumar. Every week I bring you stories from around New Zealand featuring people from all around the world who live here. You can find Here Now on all your favourite podcast platforms as well as the RNZ website.